Hey guys, how's it going? I've been wanting to make a video for a long time just talking about Disney and Boeing because I think it's really interesting where those companies are right now, how they got here, and what's potentially going to happen to them. So, obviously, we know Boeing has been a giant shit show for a long time, arguably going back 20 or 25 years. And it's really come to a head in about the last 5 years since 2019 when you had a couple of 747 Maxes crash. The investigation would eventually reveal that they were doing such smart things as offshoring software development to India for $7 an hour, because if you have safety critical software for a passenger plane, of course you want to have that done in India for $7 an hour. That's how you get really high quality software engineering. And it would also come out that Boeing had conspired to lie to regulators about the amount of pilot training that should be necessary to bring current 747 pilots up to speed so they could now fly the 747 MAX. It was obviously going to be a big deal if all of the airline pilots needed a ton of refresher training and new training for the MAX. And so Boeing just conspired to lie about it. And obviously, several hundred people died because of what Boeing did. Boeing stock took a big tumble. Then we had the lockdowns in 2020 when all the airlines were grounded for many, many months. And that didn't help Boeing a lot because, well, aircraft weren't getting flown and worn out. Service lives weren't getting worn out. Spare parts weren't being needed. Maintenance wasn't being needed. Things like that Boeing would normally get cash flows from. And now we've come forward. We've recently had the big mess with the Boeing Starliner. Of course, they had a previous launch of it a couple years ago where ultimately it failed because all the engineering minds at Boeing couldn't get a simulation lab set up correctly to run off the same time. And now we had the Starliner that went to the space station several months ago, and it got quote unquote stuck there. They just simply weren't confident enough to let the astronauts ride it back, so they eventually sent it back unmanned, and it made it back fine. But none of these things looks great for Boeing, and Boeing is kind of suffering all of these big problems at once. Of course, if you look out there today, its stock peaked in March of 2019 and it is down 65% since then. Not exactly great. They've had a lot of problems. Now, Disney's in a similar boat. I guess we could go all the way back to when they bought Lucasfilm in the 2010s, and they were kind of riding high at the time off of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Those movies were still doing very well at the time, superhero films in general. But since then, they have incinerated all goodwill from the Lucasfilm franchises that they acquired. Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Willow. Even Willow is just, a tiny little bit of the pie. But they basically destroyed all fan goodwill on all three of those. They've lost billions of dollars off of it. And one of the things that you'll see when companies are getting into trouble and they're having a hard time is they resort to ever more convoluted accounting metrics to try to make it look like things are okay. And Disney has done this a lot in the last couple of years. One of the really great ones they did earlier this year is they showed a slide during an investor presentation, and it was about how much money they had made off of Lucasfilm. And so what they showed was on one side, the amount of money that they spent to purchase Lucasfilm. It was something like $4 billion, I think. And on the other side, they said, well, here's all the revenue that we've gotten from the Lucasfilm things we've done. So all the revenue off of Star Wars movies, Indiana Jones, and merchandising sales and things like that. And any other place that they could reasonably, on an accounting statement, go and reach in and say, well, that revenue was Lucasfilm related. And of course, that kind of analysis is stupid and only fooled people who don't really have much of an accounting background, because obviously the amount of money they paid for all that Lucasfilm stuff was not just the money to acquire Lucasfilm. It was all the billions of dollars to make all of the Star Wars movies and TV series that they've made since they acquired Lucasfilm a decade ago. It was the over $1 billion that they spent to construct the Galaxy's Edge Hotel, which today sits empty. It was all the money on merchandise to produce the merchandise. And so simply saying that here's all the money we've made, well, those are revenues. That's what a customer gives you in exchange for the good or service you're providing to them. But then that's not your profit. You have costs of goods sold, you have operating expenses. In some industries, depending on how your industry accounts it, you may allocate R&D to every sale. You may have various other allocable expenses for each sale. And so basically, Disney was trying to pretend that all they had spent was the money to acquire Lucasfilm and that every dollar of revenue was instead profit. And of course, if you really look at things objectively, so far, purchasing Lucasfilm has been horrible for Disney. They've lost billions and billions of dollars. Maybe it's up to $10 billion now they've lost on Lucasfilm, not just from the purchase of Lucasfilm itself, but again, all of the flop movie and TV shows that they've made with the Lucasfilm IP, the Galaxy's Edge Hotel, everything else. It's been a disaster for Disney because they've mismanaged the whole thing. Similarly, Marvel is not doing great at this point. The entire Phase 4 of the MCU was a flop, and it doesn't look like anytime in the near future they're going to get superhero films back to the point where they are net positive once you account everything on the cost of the films. And that brings us to another one of those kind of ridiculous accounting things that companies resort to when they're desperate to try to look like they're managing things well. With Disney on the movies, it's the comparison between how much they spend on the movie and how much the movie has to make at the box office for it to break even. And so we can look at something like, I think an interesting one will be the Snow White movie, the live action Snow White movie that's going to come out later this year. Is it late this year, or is it March of 25 it's going to come out? It really doesn't matter. They're going to lose a lot of money. But basically, they had initially said they were going to spend about $200 million on this live action Snow White film, and since then they've done either 3 or 4 or 5 large reshoots of the film to respond to early criticisms, to respond to screening with test audiences and how badly the film is done in them. Then eventually they would decide that instead of using human actors for the Seven Dwarfs, they would make them CGI. Well, you know, they were already in somewhere near $400 million on producing this film, and doing good CGI was going to cost a lot more money and maybe time too. So they did really poor CGI. Then they put a black blur filter over the entire film to hide how bad the CGI was. So now the film is ugly. And so the whole thing spiraled into this really big mess where they have this $400 million monstrosity. Now, if a movie costs $400 million for Disney to produce it, how much must it make at the box office for them to break even? And you would not be faulted for naively saying $400 million. Now, the reality is that a film has to then be marketed. So that's advertisement. And that has to be in all of the areas around the world that they're going to release the film in. And the general rule is that it costs typically about as much to advertise a film as they spent on it, because if they make a more expensive film, they want to advertise it more so that more people go see it. If it's some $2 million art house thing, nobody's going to spend $100 million advertising a $2 million film, because you don't expect to make that much money off of it at the box office. So we can expect that they'll spend $300 to $400 million advertising and marketing the live action Snow White film. We'll take it in the center and we'll say $350 million. So you add that to the $400 million production costs, you're now at $750 million. And so again, you may be excused for naively saying, well, then they need to make $750 million at the box office to break even. And again, that's not correct, because they don't get all the box office money. When you go to a movie theater and you spend money on the ticket, part of that ticket money stays with the theater and part goes to the distributor, which in this case is Disney. And the amount that stays depends on a lot of things. You'll have the exact agreement, there will be regional differences, there will be national differences, and there will be temporal differences, really meaning that in the first week that a movie is in a theater, more of the money goes to the distributor than to the theater, but then that slides down a scale as time goes on until eventually it hits the dollar cinemas where, you pay $2 or $3 and you go see a movie that's 8 weeks old. Well, most of that $2 or $3 stays with the theater. At that point, the production company only gets a small fraction. Generally, the number that kind of gets bandied around is that a little more than half of the box office receipts go to the production company. So now if we have a live action Snow White film, which cost $400 million to produce and had $350 million in marketing, and Disney gets a little over half of the box office receipts, that means that the film has to make about $1.5 billion at the box office for Disney to break even. Is there a single one of you watching this video that thinks the live action Snow White is going to make $1.5 billion at the box office? I doubt it. So this is the problem that Disney has had for several years now, is they make these very, very, very expensive movies. They're bafflingly expensive because when you watch them, you say, where the hell did this money go? The CGI looks terrible. The writing is awful. The sets and the costumes look bad. And you wonder, where are they spending this kind of money? And then they have the marketing budgets on top of that, and you have the box office split, and they end up losing hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially, on each of these movies, like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Many of the Star Wars movies were losers. And on top of that, you have the Star Wars shows. And the CEO of Disney said something very funny on a conference call a couple of quarters ago. He said that, one of the big problems was that Disney had focused too much on quantity and not quality of both movies and shows for their streaming services. Now, it's a total bullshit statement. Two reasons. One is, when you're operating a streaming service, you need quantity. You need quantity so that when people turn on your streaming service and they start to doom scroll looking for something to watch, they can eventually find something that they want to turn on and sit there and watch. Because if they doom scroll too often and then abandon the service and go back to YouTube, eventually they're just going to cancel their Disney Plus subscription. So you need quantity. The second is, it's a false dichotomy to start with. The reason that the Star Wars Acolyte was so awful was not because they didn't have enough money to spend on it. It wasn't because the financial resources of Disney were spread so thin that they didn't have sufficient cash to do whatever they wanted. The Acolyte was one of the most expensive television productions ever. The final production cost per minute of time is over $600,000. $600,000 per minute that they actually produced in the end. So it was not because they didn't have enough money. It was because the writing was terrible. The sets were ugly. The costumes looked like a high school production. The dialogue was awful. The CGI was cheap. It didn't make any sense. Those were the reasons that it was awful, and it did poorly, and it got canceled. And so there was the false dichotomy there that Bob Iger was trying to push, that, hey, we need to do this. We need to focus on quality instead of quantity. And the real problem is you have clowns like Bob Iger. You have his hand-chosen board of directors, many of whom have little or no experience in entertainment. And there's no accountability. Now, you had Nelson Peltz, who is an activist investor, try to get a seat on the board earlier this year. Sadly, he failed to do that. And since that failure to acquire an activist seat on the board, Disney stock has fallen a further 25%. So congratulations, if you're a Disney shareholder and you voted against Nelson Peltz, you've lost an additional 25% of your stock value. In total, since the peak at March of 2021, Disney stock is down 54% overall. So not doing great. When it comes to the parks, Disney has spent billions of dollars at the parks in the last several years, arguably making them much worse. And the feedback from park goers is that a lot of the changes made in the parks have been to the detriment of the experience. That doesn't even go into issues over affordability of the parks. I think the affordability issues are overblown because, for the most part, the parks are still drawing good crowds, and Disney can probably make them even more expensive and still draw good enough crowds. I think they haven't found the limit to what the market will bear on the expense of getting your family into the parks yet. But certainly, many of the decisions in park renovations, reskinning rides, things like that, have not been well received, and they spent billions of dollars on them. Of course, comically, one of the reasons pointed to is that the board of the directors and a lot of the people working under them making these kind of decisions are in Burbank, California, and you have Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. I hate to break it to you, but Orlando is hot and it's bright and sunny, and they've reduced the amount of square footage that is inside and air conditioned. And it's just kind of funny seeing that kind of basic, like, stupid screw up where it's like, oh yeah, it's really hot and people need those indoor spaces to go into that are air conditioned to cool off before they can go back outside and wait for an hour and a half in line for a 4-minute ride again. So Disney has made a lot of mistakes over the last 10 years, and I could go on and on. But the point of talking about Disney and Boeing like this is to show they have objectively been terribly run businesses, terribly run for a long time. When you look at the consequences it's had for their stock share prices, yeah, they're both doing terrible. Like I said, Boeing saw its peak in March of 2019. Disney saw its peak in March of 2021. We're in September of 2024, and those stocks are way down. But what is the ultimate outcome of these situations? Is Disney going away? No. Is Boeing going away? No. Is either of these businesses going to go bankrupt? No. Is either of them going to be broken up, have certain portions of it spun off into other companies, independent companies? Very unlikely. And I know none of us like the idea of too big to fail, but Boeing is too big to fail. You know, they have their aircraft, first they have their military aircraft division that makes things like the F-15 and the F-18. They have their rotary wing aircraft division that makes the Apache, the MD-500, the AH-47. They have one of only two viable commercial aircraft production companies in the world. They're not going away. They have their satellite business, they have their spacecraft business, they have a missile business, they do training and simulation, they do all kinds of other things. So they are way too big and they are way too intertwined into both the military sphere and the commercial aviation sphere. They're not going away, they're too big to fail. Yes, none of us likes too big to fail, but Boeing is too big to fail, and so the government won't let it. Disney, on the other hand, it's not too big to fail, but it has a lot more resources at hand, and it can go a long time. And it probably will be a while longer before either of these companies has a real competent turnaround. Now, obviously, both of the companies are trying to do things today to turn the ship around, but these are huge companies where programs to create new products, whether it's a movie or a TV show or a passenger airplane or a military jet or a spacecraft, take a long time. They can take, in the case of movies, 2 or 3 or 4 years. In the case of aircraft, it can easily be 10 to 15 year design cycles. And so it's going to take a long time for either of these businesses to legitimately turn around and really start to perform at a high level again. But both of them will eventually get there. That's the reality of it. Neither of them is going away. Both of them are large enough prime players in their industries that they will survive and they will eventually turn around and make it. Now, Disney has a lot of problems in that respect because it has a ton of movies in the queue that are probably just as poor quality as the movies that they've been churning out for the last 5 years. They're going to have to make a concerted effort at turning around their movie business, and then that's going to have a couple of years to propagate through to those movies actually getting into the theater, where they can start consistently making money again on every movie instead of mostly losing money on movies and then occasionally having a Deadpool and Wolverine. Likewise with Boeing, it's seen similar problems with its new 777 and getting that design through certification and one day into production. It looks like that's recently been pushed back a couple of more years. Maybe the F-15EX can get some traction in the market and sell a couple hundred airframes. Poland just said they're going to buy 90 or 96 Apache helicopters. There's a monstrous installed fleet of F-15s and Apaches and a decent sized fleet of CH-47s worldwide. And installed military aircraft fleets represent huge, long-term rivers of money in terms of maintenance, sustainment, spare parts, logistics, upgrades, training, and everything else. And so in the long run, Boeing and Disney will both be fine. But today, they're both in a world of shit. And so, how might we relate this back to the TCG world, if we must? Well, you'll remember back in 2021 and 2022, the whole TCG market was terrible. It was in a world of shit. You had things like WotC doing everything it could to step on its own dick as hard as it could at every turn. You had Cynthia Williams destroying unbelievable amounts of customer goodwill, destroying product value, destroying the brand and its image. And at the time, people would say, oh, Magic is dead. You remember all the times we heard that? Magic is dead in 2021 and 2022. And now here we are, almost in the late part of 2024. Is Magic dead? No. Some of those products from that era are still suffering price-wise. Some have recovered, some are excelling. Magic's not dead. It's on the upswing. It's doing well. Cynthia Williams, thankfully, is gone from Wizards of the Coast, and the products are recovering in terms of the new product being produced, the print runs, the value in the products, things like that. They're all recovering. Magic, in fact, did not die, no matter how bad it looked in 2021 and 2022. Likewise, Pokemon had some of that. Not nearly as many Chicken Littles running around about the sky falling, but it had some. It had people saying that Battle Styles and Fusion Strike and Chilling Reign would never be worth anything, and Brilliant Stars was going to be a dud, and all of this, and that Evolving Skies would crash. There's no way it could sustain $300 a box, and yet here we are in 2024, and Battle Styles is $140, and Chilling Reign is $210, and Fusion Strike is $220, and Evolving Skies is almost $700, and Brilliant Stars is nearly $200, and Pokemon's doing great. For all the people who at one time or another said, oh, well, the trainer gallery is terrible on this set, it doesn't matter. It's all short-term noise. And what's going on at Boeing and Disney right now, it's not entirely short-term noise. There is a lot of long-term systemic failure. There are a lot of big things that need to be done. Bob Iger needs to go. The entire board of directors of Disney needs to go. Thankfully, Boeing recently replaced its CEO. That's a good step. But, now one of the large machinists and aviation workers unions voted on just this past Friday to strike. So I guess they've started striking over the weekend. I'm not really sure if they're, refusing overtime over the weekend, and then they won't be coming in Monday, I guess. And it's going to be painful. It's going to be painful for Disney, with probably a lot of bad movies in the lineup. The live-action Snow White is almost certain to be a giant bomb and lose a couple $100 million. Boeing's going to have huge cash flow problems over the next couple of quarters. It's going to miss delivery on a lot of airframes. And there's just a crisis of confidence in Boeing itself. It's going to take a long time to turn around. But Boeing and Disney will both turn around eventually. And we might also ask ourselves, how do we play this as investors if you are inclined to buy single stocks and to potentially among them buy Boeing and Disney? You would play it the same way that I was telling you to play the TCG market in 2021 and 2022, which was buy slowly on the way down. Eventually it'll bottom. You won't know until the future when you look back in retrospect and you see that that was in fact the bottom and not just a false bottom, a small rise before going down again. But you buy and you buy and you buy. You'll buy through the bottom, you'll buy on the way back up, and eventually you'll see that you bought all across that low area, and one day you'll be very happy with the results of that. You reach out and you catch the falling knife, because in investing, that's how you make the most money. And so nobody knows where Boeing will bottom, nobody knows where Disney will bottom. Maybe they've already hit it, and maybe when we look back 5 years from now, we'll see that they were both already on the upswing by the time I published this video. Maybe not, we don't know. But trying to time that, trying to think you're smart, trying to think, oh, I won't reach out and catch the falling knife, I'll let it hit the floor and then I'll safely pick it up. That's just hubris. You don't know where that is. And in my long and fairly successful career as an investor, both in the stock market and now the TCG world, you have to reach out and catch the falling knife. That's the way you make the most money in the long run. So there's a couple of lessons here. I think the biggest one is don't be too negative for too long. You know, when an asset is in crisis, you always have a lot of people coming out of the woodwork screaming that it's dead, that it's uninvestable, that no one will ever buy it again. There was a time in 2020 when the spot price of crude oil went negative for a day, and people said that oil companies were worthless. They said nobody will ever get on cruise ships again, no one will drive into an office again, no one will fly on business or vacations again. Ocean going vessels won't need nearly as much fuel to deliver cargo because no one will be trading anymore, and on and on and on. And they were all wrong. They were all wrong because they were taking way too short-sighted and short-term of a look at what was happening. And they weren't imagining that one day the world would open up again, people would get back on planes, they'd get back on cruise ships, they'd keep trading across the oceans, they'd start driving into the office again. And the world would almost completely return to normal, and that the total demand for oil would eventually exceed that pre-pandemic. And it has. And if you invested in oil companies in 2020, you're doing very well right now. So don't stay too negative. Don't get caught up in the waves of negativity when things like this are happening. Disney's not going away. Boeing's not going away. Magic wasn't dead. Think for yourself and look at the long term. Let me know what you think, guys. Thanks to everyone who makes this content possible, especially my very generous supporters on Patreon. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join me on Final Trade.